get you up there. We'll go ahead.
That's probably better, huh?
Thank you all for coming out.
There, I made it a little bit less bright.
Well, I think it's kind of much. That's fine in the room. Everybody here is okay with it. It's just a question of how perfect it is for the live stream audience, the 6 people in the universe that are watching.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so I'm going to make you visible to the world here. And like that. Yeah, no, that's perfect. God, that's just gorgeous. Okay, we are recording. We're streaming.
You think we were professionals or something?
We are absolutely professionals. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Professional Dog and Pony Show. All right. Nice, nice. The crowd goes wild. Chris Carlsson.
The crowd goes wild.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. It's always a pleasure to come to Beckett and be in Glen Park, one of my favorite neighborhoods, frequently walking right through here on a semi-regular basis. You're watching an endlessly looping slideshow, which is based on the slideshow I did for the first edition, which came out on the first day of COVID. March 11th, 2020 was our release party for the first edition of Hidden San Francisco. And we had it at our space, Shaping San Francisco space. If you don't know, I'm co-director of Shaping San Francisco and co-curator of foundsf.org, where much of the material that I talk about is permanently housed in various capacities, various ways. But we were holding a big party, and that was the night the NBA shut down. And everybody was kind of like washing the chairs and walking around and being kind of nervous. And so, of course, all the plans I had for promotional work for the book kind of didn't materialize. And as a result, we sold plenty of books directly, but the publisher was really excited about trying again. And so they said, well, wouldn't you like to do a new chapter and add a new preface and, write some new material for it? And I was like, well, sure, glad to, And so this just came out here this summer, Hidden San Francisco, the second edition. And one of the big additions is a new chapter that we added. So there's 4 main chapters in the original book covering labor, ecology, transportation, and dissent. So those are the sort of territories that I've always been passionately engaged with and primarily interested in as the sort of the field of history that I think kind of shapes the world we're in more than most other areas, although you could argue about the boundaries of all of those categories, and I will. But in the course of the COVID crisis, of course, we all were faced with this problem of like, okay, we were running a series of public indoor talks. The book party was one of that series in the spring of 2020. And having that shut down on us, and most people who had anything like that going on all made a decision like, let's go to Zoom. Let's just do everything on Zoom. And we were just like, oh God, Zoom. We were all doing Zoom in various capacities, and it's like the last thing we want to do is add to that. So we were anxious to get outdoors. And what we did is we created this weird idea of sort of a hybrid between a formal walking tour and a more of a kind of urban hiking club gathering of friends who share a path through the city that we maybe hadn't explored together or ever even individually in the past. And so a lot of the ones that you'll see come up again in a sequence are the walks that we came up with. We called them Urban Forum Walk and Talk. And the typical thing was to invite some neighbors or somebody who knew something about the history of that particular area to be along on the walk and add just, color, if you will, color analysts along the way. And it was just fun and did turn into a little bit of a hiking club. A lot of the folks became quite regular on that. But we became quite enamored of that experience of really going out into the city and finding paths through it that we weren't so familiar with. So I just thought that's the perfect thing to add to the book. And then the other thing I added to the book is a whole preface that covered the history of public health and epidemics and pandemics and things like that have, washed over the city since its founding as a city. And of course, even more brutally prior to the city's existence when the Spanish and other European visitors brought their microbial life with them, even in advance of their actual arrival. And the decimation to the California native population was quite severe, both prior to the arrival of the Spanish and in the 100 years prior, and then very heavily during the early days of Spanish colonization. So it's kind of a deep part of our life here, is to be beset by these really catastrophic illnesses that sweep through the population and take a lot of people away. So I wanted to have a little history of that process and how it got racialized and scapegoated throughout history. And so that's in there. And then also, how could we not talk about tech? Much as I've loathed to do it, although I should say, by way of sidelight, that one of my earliest hats that I wore, I got here in 1978. And on the first day of 1978, I moved into the Haight-Ashbury. It was 50% boarded up. and I got rent for $125 a month, half of a one-bedroom apartment in the Haight. And soon after that was involved with some interesting radicals, and we ended up starting an underground magazine that came out for its first edition in 1981 and published all the way till 1994, called Processed World. And so I had my life as an early word processor, which is a great skill when you first get it. Doubled my wages from $6 to $12 an hour. But my life in the office and my life as a critic of technology has always been a part of who I am and where I've been on the trajectory I've been on. You know, situated in the context of labor organizing, the shape of work, how technologies are used to essentially undercut skilled labor, to dismember workforces that have created patterns of mutual support and mutual aid at work, and share ways of doing things and knowledge and artisanal skills, and all those things get disrupted and broken up by the introduction of new technologies, and that's what they're for. That's why we bring new technologies into the workplaces. The owners want to break up those traditional patterns of doing things. So the labor history chapter does deal with that stuff to some extent, but I have in the introduction to the book, we talk a little bit more about that longer history of technological revolutions that keep sweeping over us as well, starting even with the gold rush, but I'm going to read a little bit about that in a couple minutes. So just to say that the book has, as I mentioned, those 4 big chapters, and I'm going to read you just a little bit from the very beginning of the first introduction to the book, called Openers. So just the opening pages from that. The approach of this book embodies a commitment to history from below, to history as lived, to documenting our time alongside critical, in-depth, sometimes controversial histories. The histories we present here will deepen your understanding of where you are and how the city got this way, and hopefully help you see your own participation in the city's life, whether as a resident or a visitor, in a new light. In the following pages, you will find a complicated and contrarian historical understanding, a dissenter's history of San Francisco, framed by the belief that history is a creative act in the present. We don't believe history is only made by politicians, business owners, and celebrities more than it is by the unsung and often ignored streetcar conductors, secretaries, ironworkers, organizers, dock workers, musicians, cabbies, and all the people that really shaped San Francisco through the years. Most of us don't tend to think of history as something we are actively engaged in, but that doesn't make it any less so. We make history together every day, both by acting in the world and by interpreting and arguing over a contested past. As you walk or bicycle through the streets of San Francisco, you are contributing to the city's history. Stop and talk to someone, take a photo and share it online. Spend some time in a park or a plaza and watch the life of the city unfold before your eyes. Show up at a concert, a poetry reading, an art show, a political protest, and you too are indelibly etched into San Francisco's history. Who knows how your presence will alter your own life or someone else's, or maybe even the trajectory of the city itself. This book peels back the layers of San Francisco history to discover memories, echoes, and ghosts of the city's storied past, often hiding in plain view. The pre-urban landscape, dramatically reconfigured by decades of digging, plowing, flattening, and filling, continues to undulate beneath the streets and buildings of 21st century San Francisco. From farming to industry to towering offices, city neighborhoods have been reinvented and re-inhabited again and again. Behind old walls and gleaming glass facades lurk former industries, secret music and poetry venues, forgotten terrorist bombings, and much more. So I'm just going to leave that as a sort of to spice it up a little bit. I mean, to get you going. I should say that, you know, it's born out of this larger project. This book is sort of the end point. I've been doing bicycle tours and walking tours since the mid-90s. And I got to be a better storyteller over the course of that period of time, or at least I hope so, through the Pavlovian experience of watching people's reactions and seeing, you know, some things land and some things don't, and some punchlines hit and other ones don't. And the truth is that the project that we created, which started, is a long, complicated story about the beginnings of shaping San Francisco that becomes the website foundsf.org. But it started as a game, and it was in the era of Myst and SimCity, and we were going to do a bike messenger game where you get knocked into the past and you have to find your way back to the present, and it was all very complicated and silly. And as we worked on it for about a year and a half, we realized, like, this is dumb. San Francisco's history is really interesting and really complicated enough without adding a fictional layer on top of silly, meaningless points that you would gather for answering essentially trivia questions. So we threw the game away and just started really focusing on developing the historical presentation. But what we were doing was, using this new format that nobody had ever done before. So if you recall, if you were around in the 90s, you might recall there was all this, insane buzz, much like what we're suffering through today with AI, for interactive multimedia, and it was going to just change everything. There was not going to be anything left of any other media form. Everything, radio, television, newspapers, all going to flow into this new delivery system on computers, coming to you on CD-ROMs, which they did for a little while. And everybody kind of knew that was an interim technology that would someday, the internet will work eventually, beyond the 56K modems that we were all depending on at the time. But here was the interesting thing, is that there was a lot of discussion happening, and it was about what does it mean to have hyperlinks, to be clicking, to going sideways, to having a non-linear presentation of history. Like, that was a new thing that nobody really had explored yet. And some of the people writing about it went so far as to argue that the reader, that is to say, the person who was clicking and moving through this information, whether it was on a public kiosk as we created in the beginning or eventually online, that they were actually writing, that reading was writing, that you were creating your own path, your own authorial path through material. And that sounded kind of interesting and provocative and plausible for a minute. But I've been working in this technology for a long time, and I can tell you it's not true. The reader is not the writer. The reader is a consumer of essentially a cacophony of material that's mostly relatively disorganized and incoherent as a whole. So if you go into Found SF, we have 2,400 screens of material, and it just goes in every direction. And everything's got hyperlinks all through, and sideways and categories and different ways of assembling the material and looking through it. And it's great. You can have a lot of fun with it, and there's a lot of great things to say about it, and I'm proud of it. I've done an incredible many hours of work in my life on that project. But this book feels better to me, and it feels better precisely because it takes the time to create a narrative structure, exactly what that other system, that other way of organizing information was trying to blow up and go for something different. The book is still the most reliable way of telling a story, of getting something across. You create a thesis, you make an argument, you develop an arc of the story, perhaps it's narrative, perhaps it's non-fictional, and at the end you come down with your conclusions, or the end of the story, as it were. And so I'm happy that I was able to finally assemble many of the stories that I've learned, but the way it's structured is that there's in the 4 big chapters that in the original backbone of the book, the labor, ecology, transportation, and descent, you have a pretty lengthy essay at the front of each chapter. And then it goes into 20 to 25 stops, which are actually numbered, and you have a map at the front of each chapter that you could follow by a bike, or you could do it by car if you're so inclined, or walking, so it'll be a long walk. That takes you through all those spots. And every one of those spots is a place where I've become familiar with other stories that lay hidden in the landscape, that are buried in various layers of history in the physical space that we call San Francisco. And so that's how the book was organized from the get-go. And then the new chapters are slight departures from that in terms of having the walking tours be organized for your experience to go right through. In fact, I'm noticing Ben Pease, who graciously let me use this map in the book. You see those big maps, these maps right here, that's from this wonderful Walker's Guide to San Francisco. This is by far the best map to get. I just happen to notice there's 3 of them sitting here right next to me on the shelf, so give him an extra plug. So what I want to do with the rest of the reading part of this time is just give you a little bit from the first book. So I had this one slide went by, you saw that there's a series of dualisms that characterize San Francisco's history, in my opinion, the way I've sort of organized my thinking about it a lot of the time. You have war and anti-war, you have labor and ecology. These things always go together in my mind. I can never think about labor and ecology without thinking about both of them, because it's the work we do that's essentially making the mess. And the mess that we all have to engage with on a daily basis, the world we've wrought, shapes the possibilities of what we can do. And inevitably, it's a dialectic process that never stops. And so that's always part of, when you talk about one, you got to talk about the other, and vice versa. So you got those as a kind of that ongoing dualism. You also have war and anti-war. This city has been, the epicenter of this city is the place where anti-war movements have erupted going well back into the 19th century. But it's also been the tip of the spear in terms of America projecting its power into the Pacific Rim, the attack on the Philippines and the conquering of the Philippines and holding it as a colony for half of a century almost. Starts and is really born out of the military apparatus that's ensconced here in San Francisco. Obviously, the Indian Wars that were carried out across the West, many of those soldiers and those commanders had their roots in San Francisco, places where they had to transit through on their way to carrying out the genocides in Northern California during the early days of California's history. So genocide and slavery. You really can't understand San Francisco's history, its founding, without understanding that it's born out of genocide. The genocide that Benjamin Madley's done such an amazing job of documenting in his book, The California Indian Tragedy, American Genocide. And then slavery, which people want to act like, oh no, California came in as a free state in 1850. There was no slavery in California. That is so false. And there's another nice book that came out not that long ago called California, a Slave State by Jean Falzer, Pfaelzer. And she goes quite a bit further than anybody's gone before her, but documenting various types of actual slavery that was really rooted in the early days of California. The most overwhelming and obvious one, which goes hand in hand with the genocide, is the encodification of Indian slavery, essentially, in the Constitution of California in 1850 and renewed again in 1860, that held that Indians could not be given full responsibilities of anything. And if any white person took them to court, an Indian that they found and said, "Judge, this person's a vagrant, give them to me." Okay, boom, 25 years, you work for that man. And they had no alternative, no recourse. They couldn't testify for themselves. They had no right to legal defense, nothing like that. And so in Northern California, according to Ben Madley's research, and his research is incredible, in the 1850s, 1 out of every 4 households had an Indian slave child living in it. It's kind of like, what? And then you realize that there was also African American slavery as well. A lot of the early arrivals before it was a state were from the South, and they brought their slaves with them and held them in that same capacity here in California. During the early 1850s, San Francisco courts continually returned people to slavery, and even to the point of having them shipped back to the Deep South on many occasions. And that finally broke in the late 1850s with a series of legal interventions and abolitionist organizing, led largely by black folks who were here. So that's an interesting part of the history of the state too. So genocide and slavery you can't get away from. Along with war and anti-war. And of course, the anti-war movements, most of us have taken part in those at one time or another, going in the recent past. Every war that's happened in the 21st century, there's been mass demonstrations in San Francisco against it. Certainly back in my earlier days, Vietnam was obviously a big deal. I grew up in the Bay Area during that era. Even earlier than that, there was pacifist movements here and support for Japanese who were becoming incarcerated during World War II. All of these things keep percolating from below here, even going back to the Philippine War, what we generally call the Spanish-American War. Mark Twain famously was one of the loudest speakers for the Anti-Imperial League of the United States, fighting against the idea that the United States should be engaged in that kind of war making and conquering, like the European powers were across the Pacific. So all those are formative to understanding the city and are mostly left out of the mainstream histories of San Francisco because it's all about great men doing great things and building this amazing place without ever any reference to those social relations that are at the base of it. The last one is a little bit more inchoate, so I'm going to read you my little section on that from the beginning of the first edition, called Modernism versus Romanticism, another dualism that I think is kind of central to the city's existence, even to the present. Almost everyone harbors at least a bit of romantic nostalgia for the city that was, especially if they never lived in it themselves. As a young urban center less than 200 years old, San Francisco tends to emphasize and glorify anything it can romantically claim as its history. In almost the same breath, San Francisco's long history of poets, writers, and iconoclastic journalists have repeatedly cast a sharp eye on the machinations of money and power here. Singers and musicians, many in San Francisco, wrote the soundtrack of the late 20th century, a heady mix of heart, hedonism, and howling opposition to the dominant society. Monopolists and militarists, politicians and businessmen have all been stripped bare by muckraking investigations and bawdy ridicule. This civic reflex comes into conflict with the untrammeled pursuit of the modern that San Francisco is also well known for. San Francisco is practically a laboratory of modern life, from its origins in land seizure and enclosure, to the massive exploitation of nature and cheap labor, to the efforts to stabilize and maintain a world based on gross inequality, a collapsing environment, and hair-trigger threats of war, based on a new foundation of surveillance capitalism. San Francisco quixotically saved its iconic cable cars in 1947, and a decade later presciently fought off a bunch of freeways. But it also has the hideously designed, by the Beckett Corporation, modernist BART train system and grandiose plans to bring the future into the heart of the city with the long-planned California high-speed rail system. We'll see if that ever happens. Historically preserved and protected buildings are all over town, amid the dull brutalism of new modernist palaces for the nouveau riche of the 21st century. During the 1970s high-rise revolt, San Franciscans resisted Manhattanization of the city. Now, skyscrapers crowd the monotonously expanding skyline, while resistance to height limits has shriveled in the face of a highly profitable and increasingly vertical new urbanism. Downtown has more than doubled its acreage since the late 1960s, when activists stopped U.S. Steel from building a 50-story monster in the Bay just north of the Bay Bridge. From the top of Rincon Hill all the way to the Washington Street boundary on the north, from the Bayshore to 5th Street, the whole South of Market has been annexed into a downtown convention center, office, and residential high-rise zone. Just south in the former rail yards of Mission Bay, a city within the city has popped up in the last 25 years, characterized by a sprawling expanse of glass-clad offices and condominiums around the 42-acre UCSF medical campus. The full length of Market Street is undergoing an unprecedented transformation from old department stores, neighborhood shops, early 20th century offices, theaters, and apartments into a shiny procession of new malls, high-rises, and luxury condominium developments. This was obviously written before COVID. Victorian and Edwardian buildings are being rehabilitated into luxury dwellings all over town, preserving the old facades while modernizing the interiors. With its pseudo-historic streetcar line and Potemkin Victorians, San Francisco has been carefully coiffed and manicured to reinforce the local economy's dependence on tourism. San Francisco is a global city, repeatedly regaled as a trendsetter, a city at the edge of the continent where countless thousands have come to discard old identities and resurface with imagined pasts and uncharted futures. Innovators have been welcomed by a bohemian culture suspicious of fixed truths, ossified class boundaries, and imported traditions. Music, literature, poetry, technology, art, cooperation, and collective invention have all flourished in San Francisco. The same cultural dynamism has also provided a rich foundation from which huge corporations have grown to straddle the globe, while their owners have exercised an enduring control over the city's growth and development. San Francisco holds a vital place at the heart of modern world history. The city's own saga is barely 200 years old, and yet those years straddle the U.S. imperial push across North America and into the Pacific, the Industrial Revolution and the emergence of class war, mass migration and racism, technological breakthroughs from railroads to photography, agriculture to chemicals, machines to microchips, and more. It's also an epicenter for resistance to war, home to the beginnings of the anti-nuclear movement in the 1950s, the neighbor-driven campaign to stop the freeways in the 1960s, the unparalleled success of the Save the Bay movement in preserving and cleaning up the San Francisco Bay since 1963, and for changing how we live among ourselves by shattering norms of racial, sexual, and gender stereotypes. The city's immigrant ethnic groups continue to organize and resist the deep historical racism that has dominated elite policymaking here. San Francisco manages to be both a beacon to malcontents and nonconformists, and one of the most tightly run oligarchic municipalities in the country. The distribution of power and influence results from an endless tussle between competing interests, factions, organizations, and movements as they ebb and flow across time. Moments of contestation and conflict saturate our past, whether we know it or not, as our predecessors made decisions that continue to reverberate down the years. A definitive portrait of how we got here is elusive, but by revisiting locations and histories across the ever-changing landscape, we can uncover continuities and contradictions and present our version of how the city arrived at this moment. Like any history worth its name, it's not meant to be the last word, but a contribution to our ongoing shared efforts to understand how the hell it turned out like this. So from there, I have, as I mentioned, these big chapters, and I'm slightly tempted to read you some of those things. But I think I'm going to keep it a little bit shorter and hopefully have some interesting conversation together with you. And I'm going to read you two last little excerpts here. One is about the public health story, a brief history of public health. Let me drink a little bit of water. And then the other is the sort of the wrap up of the new introduction to the book that tries to come to some sort of grips with where we are after the pandemic. A brief history of public health in San Francisco. To seriously address issues of public health, you must go considerably beyond the narrow epidemiological facts of a given bacteria or virus and address the full range of influences on human and ecological well-being. Public health, taken to its logical conclusion, is at odds with bedrock principles of American economics and ruling class entitlement. Peter Linebaugh usefully distinguishes between microparasites, such as viruses, and macroparasites, such as corporations and ruling classes. The macroparasite attacks by grinding its hosts into poverty, malnutrition, and destruction of pith and marrow. The immune system is defeated by overwork and extraction of increasing surplus value, says Peter. Poverty has always been a breeding ground for chronic and severe disease. The origins of modern California are built on the rapid decimation of the original people here by rampant, unchecked disease. The deadliest recorded disease outbreak in San Francisco began in March or April of 1806. At the end of April, 400 neophytes, Ohlone natives impressed into Mission Dolores, were sick with measles. By the end of May, 800 were sick and 200 already dead. By the end of the year, every girl under 5, 3/4 of all baby boys, and half of all women of reproductive age died in the mission. A second measles epidemic would strike the missions in 1821, then a third in 1827, and an influenza event killed many in 1832, and many more mission neophytes died in the smallpox epidemic of 1844. The missions were a petri dish of communicable diseases. Historian and San Francisco State professor Philip Dreyfus describes the unsanitary conditions at Mission Dolores. Quote, whereas natives had lived in lightweight and airy tule grass structures that they burned periodically when infested with vermin, the mission accommodations were of adobe brick. Dark, damp, overcrowded, and unsanitary, these adobe dormitories were breeding grounds for disease. The priests' practices of protecting female virtue by locking girls and women into these often windowless dungeons at night with a single blanket apiece could not have been conducive to good health. Furthermore, mission population densities that were artificially large compared to those of natives' villages aggravated problems of sanitation and water pollution and promoted epidemic conditions. The general effect was an extraordinarily high death rate, especially among women and children. This human tragedy delivered the crowning blow to the ecological revolution the Spaniards had unleashed. End quote. Communicable disease was not well understood during the Spanish colonization period from 1776 to 1823. The Mexican period saw no urbanization, but the expanding cattle economy brought with it its own hygiene and health issues to further reaches of Northern California. When the Americans came in and took California from Mexico through a fraudulent war in 1846, a full-scale genocide was unleashed against native Californians. The ersatz village of Yerba Buena quickly expanded into a San Francisco without decent fresh water supplies and no waste system at all. Cholera hit the city repeatedly in its earliest decade, along with rampant communicable diseases of many types, from diphtheria to typhoid fever and influenza to tuberculosis. In City of Plagues, Susan Craddock shows how poor people were harshly pathologized in 19th century San Francisco, individually blamed for getting sick, since their poverty was a result of their poor character, not an unequal social division of wealth. San Francisco's white workers directed their frustration and racist wrath at the Chinese almost from the beginnings of statehood in 1850, and recurring smallpox, tuberculosis, syphilis, diphtheria, and other disease outbreaks were repeatedly blamed on the Chinese. Over a century later, San Franciscans suddenly stopped dining in Chinatown in December 2019, when reports of a scary flu in China began to circulate. 19th century public health officials took advantage of this prevailing logic to invade Chinatown on missions to clean it up, leading most dramatically between March and October 1903 to the destruction of 160 buildings and the eviction of 70 more in the small neighborhood during a bubonic plague eruption. After the 1906 earthquake, the devastated city was overrun by hundreds of thousands of rats, and it was finally understood that fleas on rats were the source of bubonic plague. Chinatown was one of only 3 districts that did not have a plague problem, since the neighborhood had already been rebuilt and sanitized with repeated uses of chlorinated lime, carbolic acid, bichloride of mercury, and other noxious substances, none of which were ever studied for their own negative health effects. The rest of the city went on a rat-killing frenzy and also began pouring cement where wooden floorboards had been in basements and backyards. Dr. Rupert Blue, the city's health commissioner, said, quote, "The disease was being built out of existence. This is the hope of San Francisco, and in time that city will be one block of concrete throughout." End quote. Almost succeeded. It was this same post-quake campaign that led to the removal of chicken coops, horse stables, and all domestic livestock from San Francisco. A decade later, the 1918 flu ripped through San Francisco twice, even inspiring a public revolt against wearing masks, before being largely forgotten until COVID-19 refreshed our memories. And it goes on more into tuberculosis and the long history around that in San Francisco, and then what we did around COVID, bailing out the owners of society. And then I'm going to just go to the conclusion of this opening introduction to the second edition. At no point since the early 1990s has there been a municipal government that tried to implement anything close to a left-wing approach to the city's problems. Of course, the recent history of San Francisco is much more complicated than any simple sketch can describe, especially one limited to describing the politics of the city's political leaders. More than a half-century ago, the owners of wealth in San Francisco steered municipal priorities to back a grand bet that San Francisco would be home to the headquarters of far-flung multinational corporations to sustain its prosperity and well-being. Rooted in a consensus of the rich, city officials and local government, bureaucrats at the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency, and anyone associated with the port or planning or zoning all worked to facilitate the rapid expansion of downtown. Skyline images from the late 1950s to the present show how densely the city was built up, a pattern not unique to San Francisco, but perhaps more dramatic because many people who lived here fought against Manhattanization from the late 1960s to the mid-1980s. In 1975, George Moscone was elected mayor, and he might have helped steer the city in a new direction, given his ardent support from the neighborhood activists who got him elected. But he was assassinated, along with first-ever gay supervisor Harvey Milk in 1978, and the corporatist Democrat Dianne Feinstein ascended to mayor. She focused on expanding downtown high-rise office buildings as the cornerstone of her economic policy. At the time, San Francisco was still home to Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Standard Oil of California, Chevron, Bechtel Engineering, Pacific Gas and Electric, Del Monte Corporation, Levi's, and dozens of other globe-straddling corporations. But during the 1980s, under the neoliberal market frenzy of mergers and acquisitions unleashed by the Reagan administration, one San Francisco corporate icon after another was swallowed up by raiders. For example, Bank of America was taken over by a North Carolina bank, Wells Fargo by a Minnesota bank, Del Monte by RJR Nabisco. The rapid expansion of suburban edge cities led to other large companies moving their operations out of San Francisco. For example, Chevron moved its headquarters to Pleasanton in the East Bay. Del Monte went through a dozen further sales and reorganizations before ending up as a subsidiary of NutraAsia in the East Bay town of Walnut Creek today. Though software giant Salesforce still calls San Francisco home after emptying most of its downtown towers, few other multinationals are based in the city anymore. The once seemingly safe bet on office expansion has soured, and the future of millions of square feet of empty office space is an open question. Current efforts to create pop-up cultural spaces, free leases for museums, etc., seek to kickstart new economic activities based on tourism and cultural production. But it's unlikely that any such efforts will rebuild the economic value of these 21st century white elephants. San Francisco's economic problems cannot be addressed at the municipal level alone. Objections to homelessness as unsightly and scary elide the simple fact that severe poverty is a necessary companion of the intense concentration of wealth that is settled here. You can't have the latter without the former. The boom and bust cycle that characterizes San Francisco's economy, Going back to the original tech boom based on new hydraulic technologies to extract gold from Sierra granite, shows no signs of abating. The most recent tech boom popped loudly amidst the general collapse imposed by the pandemic. Subsequent efforts to reinflate a tech bubble by hyping the metaverse, cryptocurrencies, and most recently artificial intelligence have each succumbed to their own busts, AI just beginning its reckoning as I write, or perhaps an emerging pivot to positioning AI as crucial to new weapon systems will save it. Will the wealthy proponents of a nerd Reich manage to take over the city government? Or will they just continue to poison the city with their self-serving classist and racist expectations? San Francisco's subversive cultural pulse has not been completely silenced yet, in spite of the severe contraction of cheap rent, open space, and free time, the three elements essential to a city's thriving cultural life. Even during the depths of the pandemic, tens of thousands of San Franciscans filled the streets to protest the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and to support the ongoing campaign for Black lives. The fight is unfolding now, and it won't likely be resolved for years to come. We are not alone. The pandemic was clearly as much an ecological crisis as a public health one, and a harbinger of more to come. The COVID-19 virus killed a lot of people and made many more quite ill. But it's worth pondering the deeper assumptions about life and boundaries it brought forth. As recent scholarship in theoretical biology argues, we are not really individuals, but whole societies of symbiotic and mutually constitutive species. Cruder politicians like to insist that they just follow their gut. And while that may be a dumb repudiation of intellect, the truth is that we all probably follow our gut in ways we can barely understand. The microbiota we coexist with are apparently more influential than we know. How does our relationship with our digestive system affect our thinking on any given day? How about our relationships with the animals around us, the birds and bees? Kate Brown, writing in The New Yorker, expanded on this different way of imagining ourselves. And here's a quote. The interconnectedness of our biological lives, which has become even clearer in recent decades, is pushing us to reconsider our understanding of the natural world. Our picture of the human body is shifting too. It seems less like a self-contained vessel, defined by one's genetic code and ruled by a brain, than like a microbial ecosystem that sweeps along in atmospheric currents, harvesting gases, bacteria, phages, fungal spores, and airborne toxins in its nets. End quote. In another New Yorker, Kim Stanley Robinson, the great science fiction writer, emphasized how the coronavirus was rewriting our imaginations. Not only did we have a moment to pause and contemplate the nearly 8 billion of us living on the planet, but it became starkly obvious that our bizarrely complex existence is completely dependent on all sorts of scientific achievements, from agriculture to medicine. As Robinson puts it, quote, "We feel the reality, which is that the whole system is a technical improvisation that science keeps from crashing down," end quote. We'll soon be confronted with another pandemic, or more dramatically, permanently altered patterns of weather and water due to climate change. Just months after the pandemic took hold, California was ravaged by massive wildfires. San Franciscans woke up on September 9th, 2020 to a day without sunlight. A deep red hue provided the only light as the sun shone down on a bay buried in dense smoke for an entire day. Weeks of smoky air continued to afflict Northern California, and most of us realized it was a new normal that we had to get used to. News from afar during the last few years gave alarming reports that Cape Town in South Africa, Sao Paulo in Brazil, or Atlanta in the United States faced catastrophic collapses of water supplies. Each city dodged that bullet when rains appeared at the last minute and replenished nearly dry reservoirs. But as a global civilization, never more apparent than now under viral pressure, megacities are traipsing ever closer to catastrophic system failure. Science may help with urban redesign and technological improvisation, but not if we can't find ways to engage with each other politically and psychologically and find previously untapped reserves of empathy, compassion, and mutual assistance. The pandemic led most San Franciscans to compassionate empathy and mutual aid. This happened even though for more than a year most of us only saw each other's eyes from behind ubiquitous masks. But we also saw the inexorable rhythm of modern life grind to a halt. The air cleared and birdsong filled our streets, along with neighborly strolls, leisurely bike rides, and time to chat. Slow streets were claimed from the expectation that all public thoroughfares are for private cars, and in San Francisco several were made permanent after the original impetus passed. A key road in Golden Gate Park was permanently closed to cars by popular vote after years of trying. And a similar campaign has been accomplished. It was underway when I wrote this, to make the Great Highway along Ocean Beach a new urban parkway for pedestrian, cyclists, and other non-motorized uses. Coyotes expanded their presence in San Francisco along with raccoons, crows, and ravens and parrots. Whales, harbor porpoises, sea lions, and harbor seals are all more common in the bay and along the Pacific shore than they have been in more than a century. Red-tailed and red-shouldered hawks are a regular presence in our skies, and we've even seen a mountain lion make its way into urban San Francisco. The Natural Areas Division of SF Rec Park has preserved and expanded dozens of remnant habitats, more appreciated than ever during and after the pandemic. These areas are home to the original web of life on the peninsula, giving a boost to long-suffering native plants, insects, and birds. Between the break imposed by the pandemic and the ongoing efforts to bolster and restore natural systems in the San Francisco Bay Area, real results are beginning to be felt now. During the surprising interregnum imposed by the pandemic, the urgent frenzy to be busy subsided, and untold numbers of people joined a great refusal and abandoned crappy jobs they thought they couldn't live without. In the absence of incessant mass spectator sports and the time-filling routines of daily life, the biggest mass protest movement in U.S. history erupted to demand an end to racist killings by police. Millions of people had an enticing taste of how much different life could be. In the early months of the pandemic, it seemed impossible that we would go back to what had been normal life. But as I write this, and as we live this, daily life, again, closely resembles what it was before the shutdown. Sometimes the pandemic years already seem like a bad dream, but we remember how real it was. It showed us plainly that things can change, quickly and completely. The next time we face a rupture, whether due to pandemic, natural disaster, or social upheaval, maybe we'll remember what's possible and choose a life radically different from the one we have. San Francisco remains, in spite of everything, a place where such a radical break might have a chance. And that's what I wanted to read to you today. Thank you. Happy to field questions or denunciations, angry rebuttals. Sorry?
You mentioned there were three things that are key to invigorating and maintaining culture in a way that is rich and not overly capitalistic.
Yeah.
What were those?
Cheap space, free time, or low rent, basically.
Yeah.
Free time and open space. So places where we can meet together in public without having to buy and sell things. I was one of the nice things. I was part of the gang of conspirators who helped start Critical Mass back in the day, and one of the key elements that I would always argue for in that context was that it was just bicycling. Yeah, sure, we all want to have better conditions for bicycling, but what we really needed was public space, and almost all spaces have been enclosed and put to use for shopping, essentially, or just moving you from place to work or go home and watch TV. And so, funnily and interestingly, we, by rolling along the streets in a group, had somehow reinvented the use of street space for ourselves as a place where we could have arguments and dialogue and tell stories and laugh and joke and pick up on each other and do all sorts of things that people like to do when they're out in public together, but don't really have any places to do it. And I feel like, again, it's sort of shrunken again in this moment. We're still suffering that problem of having very little public space, and the public spaces that we have are often under duress because the city, considers that the people who are in them shouldn't be there, and they try to drive them out. Of course, there's tons of people who don't have a roof over their heads. So that also compromises the idea of public space quite a bit. But those are the three things that I don't think you can have a really vibrant culture without: low rent, public space, and free time. Less work would be right behind all that, or perhaps the informing piece of it that would make all those other ones possible. Yeah, David.
I have a question about Processed World.
Sure.
Is there an archive of it?
There is an archive of Processed World. It's online at the Internet Archive. So if you go to archive.org and you search for Processed World Magazine or Processed World Collective, you'll get the entire run. And that includes the issues. We did 32 issues from 1981 to 1994. We used to sell them on the streets in downtown San Francisco, dancing around in strange costumes. I had a paper mache VDT head that said IBM, Intensely Boring Machines. And the other one was GM, General Monotony. And then we had a Data Slave. And then we had a Tide box that said Bound, Gagged, and Tied to useless work day in, day out for the rest of your life. And we would dance around on Market in Montgomery or Sansom and Market. And, you know, holding up the magazine. If you hate your job, you'll love this magazine. Check it out right here. Take the afternoon off and read a magazine. And that's how we sold them. And that's how we met the readers and writers for the most part. It was directly that way on the street. So we were down there every Friday from 1982 to 1984. And then after we kind of shut down in 94, it was an interesting story why that happened, but I'll leave that aside. We actually came back together and did another issue in 2001 to celebrate 20 years since the first one. And that came out really good. And we had so much fun doing it. We thought, well, let's do another one. So we did another one called 2005 that by the time we got it done, there was two of us still being nice to each other and working together. And everybody else had once again quit in a huff and nobody liked each other anymore. So that was that. We'll never do another one. But it's all online at Internet Archive, and they're free to download and do whatever you want with them. They're pretty much anti-copyright magazines. A lot of people are you know, kind of impressed by it when they discover it because of how much we were involved in this critique of the world that now has fully taken shape and, you know, and overwhelming us. In some ways, we didn't anticipate everything that's going on now, but there's a lot of stuff we talked about. I mean, we had a whole issue on artificial intelligence in 1983. We were talking about it back then when Marvin Minsky and his meat machine ideas were prevailing, and many other issues. So, you know, the magazine was quite eclectic, but it was full of a lot of humor, a lot of really funny jokes. Yeah.
You'll have to forgive me, I just arrived. There was a bus problem.
Okay, you're forgiven.
Thank you, I appreciate it. There aren't enough bike lanes in San Francisco. To ask a perfectly naive questions, what would it take to get more, I mean, bike lanes on every street. I mean, that's what we need. What would it take to get more bike lanes?
A cultural shift, a major cultural shift in which public transit was heavily funded and readily available wherever you needed to go. And many people who currently think they have to have a car to survive and live here would be willing to stop doing that and make it punitively heavily taxed to own a car. It's already pretty expensive. I don't know why people don't figure out how darn expensive it is to own a car, but they oftentimes think that's cheaper than other options. But I mean, my preference would be to take 10% of the city's streets and make them completely car-free. Because, you know, cars get everything. They get every square inch of the city, except for the tiny few places that they don't. But almost every place is car overwhelmed by cars. And I also have a recurrent theme that I like to bring up, which is one lane for food. Like, there's a lot of streets that are super wide in San Francisco because we want to move so many cars back and forth through the city all the time. It's like, why? Or park them all over the place. Why? It's absurd. You know, why don't we just start talking about having linear farms and growing a lot of the food that we consume in the city? We could actually have, I don't know if you know this, but at the end of World War II, at the sort of the tail end of when the Victory Garden movement had been at its peak, all throughout North America and the United States and Canada, 45% of all the fresh fruit and vegetables were coming from urban gardens and urban farms. Today it's less than 3%. And when you think about the carbon footprint of driving all this produce around or flying it from Chile or flying it from wherever they're flying it in from Mexico, I mean, it's crazy, the world we built. It doesn't make any sense at all. So you could start, you know, re-centralizing your efforts to grow what you need locally. I mean, it's a different approach to living, which, you know, I appreciate your question because that's, I was doing, after Critical Mass kind of has lived its life here in San Francisco. Obviously, it's just a zombie ride at this point. But for many years, I was invited to these talks, to these gatherings in South America that were based on the fact that there had been a banker who drove through Critical Mass at full speed in 2011 in the city of Porto Alegre in Brazil and was not being prosecuted. So they called the world to come in 2012 to help them get attention for this failure of justice. And so me and a lot of people came there from all over the world and had the first World Bike Forum, they called it. And then that went on every year. And it moved from city to city. It was kind of just Brazilian at first. And then it went to Colombia and then to Mexico City and Chile and Quito, Ecuador, and Lima, Peru, etc. And I was invited to come quite a few times. And I could give a big keynote speech every time. And I kind of ran out of things to say because I felt like I kept saying the same thing, which kind of was summarized by the idea that if bicycling is the key, what does it unlock? Or if bicycling is the window, when we go through the window, what's on the other side? Because a lot of people get excited about bicycling. They think bicycling is an end in and of itself, and it's absolutely not. It's just one of the many choices we can make to change how we move through the urban environment, and it's a better choice than a lot of the other ones. Absolutely, I got here on a bike. I ride a bike everywhere. I don't own a car. That's how I get around. But a lot of people, that's not going to work for them in this current moment, and you can't like morally guilt trip people for not bicycling if they don't feel comfortable doing it or don't like bicycling or whatever their decision is. But for the people who do get excited about it, they need to think bigger. Because it's not just to change how we move. We have to change how we do everything. How do we provide for ourselves? How do we work with each other? What kind of work do we do? Why do most jobs exist? Most jobs are a waste of time. They should stop tomorrow. And then let's talk about the work that we should be doing, which we're not doing, which is changing how we produce food, changing our relationship to fresh water, changing our relationship to transportation. All of these things should be in the popular conversation, but almost never are. But when you start getting people activated around bicycling, I always like to think, that opens the door. It opens the mind to think differently about all these other ways that we reproduce this life, and we could actually start reproducing a different life if we chose to. Because the work we do makes the world, and people don't really know what to do about that because it's very hard to collectively organize yourself to completely remake the entire world all at once. That's not going to happen. But what can you do in your immediate life to start taking something, where like my idea of one lane for food, like how could we do that? Start advocating for having free fruit trees on whole corridors of the city where people could then have free food. Why not? There's a lot of things we could do like that. We could make a lot of things. We should make all muni rides free for everybody. Not try to get money out of the box. Just tax rich people and let them pay for it. It'd be very easy to cover the cost of it. Unwelcome thoughts.
You had a great. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Either one.
You had a great comment, or line regard to Market Street prior to COVID. What are your thoughts on what did we do with the Westfield Center? How for this open space that will remain that way?
Yeah, that's a problem I'm glad I don't have to answer for, because it's a mess. It's like that building's kind of useless in its current configuration. Obviously, the dire need to provide decent housing for people who don't have any housing should overwhelm all other possibilities at this point. It's just such a crime that we let people sleep in the streets and treat it as though they failed. It's their problem, when it's a social decision starting under Reagan to do this, to destroy didn't even just start under Reagan. Really Nixon was a big part of gutting public housing too. So we should have a massive increase of budget from the federal, state, and local levels to build public housing so everybody has a right to a roof, to a right to decent shelter, not just the crappy falling apart public housing structure, but actually a really nice apartment. Everybody gets a really nice apartment. That should just be a basic minimum of life. And all the food, water, all those things should just be provided. Like, there's no reason in the world why this wealthy society can't give everybody everything they need. There's enough of everything for everybody. It's not a shortage. And so Westfield Mall is just an example of the incredible stupidity of modern market life that allows, first, building a mall where you might have done something more interesting with it. And then now that it's empty, just standing there paralyzed going, well, what do we do? I don't know. What can we do? The private capital has to solve this, so they got to come in and make money somehow else. No, fuck that. Take it away from them through eminent domain, and let's reconfigure it into beautiful apartments for 500 people or 2,000 people or however many people we could put in there comfortably. And, bring in the building trades. Tim's here. Bring in the building trades to rebuild the entire inside of that into this palatially beautiful place, to provide really nice place to live for everybody that currently has no place to live. That would be an inspiring project, right? I think a lot of us would be like, oh my God, I'm proud to live here if we're doing that. That makes me happy about having a city government that's finally doing something useful, instead of letting, essentially saying we got this crazy Lurie plan to upscale, upzone everywhere and just build tall buildings that, private capital who needs this 20% return on investment to make any move at all to do anything. That's insane, waiting for that to be the motor of our society. It's completely insane. Now, how many billionaires live in San Francisco right now? Something like 50? take their money. It's very simple.
How big a problem is it that, kids can't find productive work to do and paid work to do? I mean, people come asking me for jobs all the time. I got nothing for them.
Yeah.
I can't afford to employ them. My kids grew up with, eventually they found their way through the school system and higher ed and whatever, and they survived till they got to be adults and figured out how to put things together. But, if you got people on the street who, there's no jobs for them,
Yeah, well, I mean,
what's wrong with a job? A job is a good thing, but if it's going just to highly paid staff of corporations, and not going to people on the ground level, the gardens would be good.
I mean, that speaks to the complete insanity of how we've structured our productive lives around wage labor, and the idea that the people with money should be able to decide what gets done based on their ability to derive a profit from it, and if it doesn't have that as the end point, it doesn't happen. And then the idea of providing people who have, all the people living on the streets have capacities. Nobody's even asking them, what would you like to do? What could you do if you were given, the ability to contribute? Like, what would you like to do? I bet you 85 to 90% of the people on the streets would be delighted to help out in whatever capacity they have to do something useful instead of the life they're living right now. That's just normal. And then for the large number of people who haven't yet fallen into that level of penury, but are nevertheless, one step from it, or feel that nervousness that, can't find the job, can't get adequate income, can't pay the rent, can't make ends meet. It's insane. There's been this insane concentration of wealth. The answer is to take their fucking money and then redistribute it to everybody else, so we all have enough of what we need, if we're going to keep using money as a mechanism for organizing our lives. But I would prefer to do something more directly, where we stop the logic in which you have to be employed and get a wage in exchange for your time, and if you don't work hard enough, you get punished. And I mean, it's just like, no, everybody do whatever you want. I've written a novel about that called After the Deluge, which takes place in 150 years. But it's a world in which, the money and markets have been abolished. And I just thought, like, if I'm going to advocate for that, I should be able to describe how it works. So I wrote a whole novel in which that's how the world works. It's just that there's enough of everything for everybody. It's generalized abundance. That is actually the world we live in. You wouldn't know it because of how it gets organized through artificial scarcities and prices and whatnot. But there's plenty for everybody. And so this world in the future, there's a free market for the individual. You do whatever you want. And the premise, which is what we don't really ever get to talk about, it's actually a deep philosophical question. What do you think is human nature? I think human nature is fundamentally cooperative and fundamentally constructive. Like, people want to contribute. They don't want to get taken advantage of, but they want to pull their own weight. Everybody has a sort of sense of their own dignity by pulling their own weight, doing their share. And if that was the cultural impulse that we actually advocated for and talked about all the time, my God, we'd live in incredible abundance, because everybody would actually be doing the things that need to be done. And all the stupid work that goes on to produce a stupid world, let's stop all that work. Like, we're actually destroying the planet. Every day it gets worse. We need to reverse path. We got to stop a lot of what we do and start doing the things that aren't getting done.
So Chris,
yeah.
since thank you for starting to call me out. I might as well throw a little something in there about housing, and you talked about and there's not going to be a question embedded in here, but you talk about that mall that's been sitting there. I actually went to the goddamn ceremony where everybody had free champagne when they opened that place up in Bloomingdale's and what have you, and everybody thought this is the best thing in the history of the earth. And at that time, the people that actually went to that opening were the construction workers that built that place, that made a pretty damn good paycheck for the 2-3 years that was happening. And I happened to go to it because I was invited. Anyway, there is a solution that I actually had thought of arbitrarily, and that is, and it happens more in Minneapolis and Chicago than anywhere, but people that work for under a collective bargaining agreement in a union get a pension plan. That pension plan is as Wall Street and as capital as anything else. I don't care where you put your money, if it's well done or not well done. It's Wall Street driven. That money, there is a fund. There's an AFL-CIO housing fund. There's other funds, and you might know about this. And it's used, and it's been used in San Francisco, where you can take that damn money, that $2, $3, $10 an hour that I make and it's being invested, when I retire, I get some goddamn pension. The few of us that are still in unions that have those real pensions, and there is a fund that's set up to say, we are going to build housing. And the housing is gonna be done in conjunction with a developer that will agree to certain methods. And that is, all the work on the place has to be done union at prevailing wages and livable wages and whatever. All the units in there have to have, and the farthest the world has gotten so far is these quotas. You gotta have 25%, you gotta have 20%, you gotta have, like in Mission Bay in San Francisco, they have 40%, quote unquote, affordable housing. People that actually, where they actually took a grid and said all those buildings that are going up there by the ballpark, this small real estate, or big real estate company that used to be a ball team, the San Francisco Giants, and there's 40%. And there's money that goes in there for people that are willing to say, we will invest in that. Now that is a very, very small percent of the market-driven economy, but there is, mostly in places like Minneapolis and Chicago, they are building buildings that will have like 500 to 800, urban areas where they will have housing, of which they will designate, first of all, everybody in there has to work, under a union contract, the plumbers and the sheet metal people and everybody else, and the housing has to be, quote unquote, affordable on the biggest envelope that people have. There's gotta be at least 30% housing, with a priority on the teachers and the union members and
Yeah.
whatever else that are in there that get in there. But that's, it's been gone on for a while, but it's a little niche and stuff, and there's been stuff in San Francisco that's been built that way.
Yeah, no,
Especially
I know.
during the downturn of the economy.
Right.
A lot of the shit that went up downtown, and whether or not it was good stuff or not, was done because union members put their pension funds in there to stimulate work.
Mhm.
Yeah, they might have built, some tower, but there are certain funds that are just dedicated to housing. And now
Yeah,
shut the
no, I'm
fuck up.
familiar with, I knew about the AFL-CIO pension fund going into a bunch of those big glass towers down there.
Right.
Yeah.
But they have a dedicated fund. There's 4 different funds, okay? And why do I know this? I don't know. Shoot me. But, cause I worked on it.
Yeah.
But there's one that's called the Housing Fund, the AFL-CIO Housing Fund. And there are those affordable requirements. We're not gonna build it unless people can live in them. Anyway.
We are gonna have an interesting housing conversation.
And that mall would be a perfect place. Everybody
Yeah.
jabbers, housing, housing, housing.
Yeah.
And now we have somebody, a law and order mayor that says, we got other priorities about, making sure people in the Sunset are.
I mean,
getting
apparently there's
screwed out of stuff.
tens of thousands of units in the pipeline that have been approved, many of which are affordable, and they're not getting built because the return on investment's not adequate for the people that finally pull the plug on that stuff, so. Anyway, we're gonna have a conversation on neither NIMBY nor YIMBY, discussion about social housing at our ongoing public talks at Shaping San Francisco at October 22nd at 518 Valencia, if you're interested. I have a couple of calendars with me if anybody wants one. Anything else anybody wants to bring up? Yeah.
Have you ever done a walking tour that goes through the center of San Francisco, which happens to be right next to where I teach elementary school?
Yeah, we did do. I think it was one of the crosstown portions of the trail, and somebody dragged us over there to see that little thing in the sidewalk there, right underneath your school. So yeah, I know exactly where that is on Corbett, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny because you wouldn't think that's the geographic center. Some people had said to me before that it was Mount Olympus was the actual geographic center of the city, but that I haven't done the math, so I wouldn't want to defend any particular position on that. But yeah, it's fun to be wandering around in the hills, and I mean I always advise people. There's a lot of books about Ada Belinsky and these other folks who did stairway walks all over the city, and stairways are incredible. So if you just go out and start following your nose and try to find them, and then just to go for obscure walks like that, that's the most fun way to get to know the city by far. And now I have a bunch of them in this book too, so anybody who wants to get one can follow these for starters. But once you see these walks and you go on them, you realize like, oh my God, I want to go that way. You don't have to stay on the walk. You could just follow your nose and enjoy the incredible weird angles and vistas that you've never seen before that are really readily available. It's so easy to never leave the boundaries of San Francisco and have unbelievable walks and see incredible nature moments all over the city, and it's always available to us. It's one of the things I like about living here. Dave?
Where can we buy this book of yours?
Don't you have any? Eric has a whole pile of them in the back, luckily.
Indeed I do.
So
You can't leave here without buying at least one, right?
yeah, I hope so. Yeah, that's part of why we do these things. I'm also going to be doing the same talk again in 2 days at the North Beach Branch Library at 4:00 in the afternoon on Saturday. So send your friends.
Check the book out there?
Pardon me?
Can you check the book out there?
That's what I
The
hope people.
library?
Yeah, I hope they have some there. I don't think I can sell them there because it's a library. So
Well, I mean, it's a library check.
I can sneak outside on the sidewalk. Hey, psst, want to buy a book? Well, thank you all for coming, and I'm happy to hang out and chat some more if you want to. So happy to sign your books too if you buy books.